please, without further ado, welcome virtually Dr. Caitlin Fitz. But first, we have to unmute her.
All right. Thank you, Scott. Thank you for that introduction, and thanks to everyone who has joined in today. Before I get started, I want to just briefly share my screen, although I think at the moment, oh, there we go. I'm now able to share. Okay. Wonderful. Get my laser pointer. Okay. So I am really delighted to be joining in as part of the museum's virtual July 4th celebration. And in honor of the impending holiday, I wanted to start us off with a bit of time travel. So we are going to travel back almost exactly 200 years to July 4th, 1820. And here, just to help paint the picture, is an image of what one July 4th celebration looks like. And you can see I'm cheating here a little bit because this image is from 1819, not 1820, but I chose it because it's in Philadelphia, and it gives a sense of some of the activities that people would typically have been engaged in at an Independence Day party. So we can see there would have been music. We've got this fiddler here. There's military guys marching around in the background. Another thing that would have happened at these festivals, although you only get a small approximation of it in this tent on the left, is that white men in particular would have gathered for these big dinner parties where they would eat special holiday delicacies like turtle soup, perhaps, which was, alas, exactly what it sounded like. In the South, barbecue was especially common. If you lived in a part of the country where somehow you had managed to save up snow and ice from the winter, which New Englanders could actually do, and they also exported ice to other parts of the country and world, then maybe you would be lucky enough to taste a little bit of ice cream. And so white men, and I'll say more in a minute about why this is white men in particular, would sit at these dinner parties and raise their glasses and toast the causes that they cared about most. Now, if we were in person today, as originally planned before COVID, I would ask you at this point what you thought some of the more common July 4th toasts were in this period. And I have posed this question to my students, and they always come up with lots of very good and correct answers. Toasts were to the 4th of July, the Declaration, the Constitution, the Revolution, veterans, to political and military leaders like George Washington, Adams, Jefferson, depending on the crowd's location and political affiliations. And all of these are toasts that I think it's fair to say we might expect from a group of white American men in 1820. Of course, they're going to toast the Declaration on Independence Day. But what most struck me as I started to look at these July 4th celebrations was that in the decade that followed the War of 1812, so about 1816 through 1825, toasts to Latin America were actually very common. People would raise their glasses, here I've got a glass here, and they would drink to, as they put it, our sister republics of South America, which is of course where the title of my book comes from. According to one newspaper editor, toasts to South America were second in number only to toasts to the Revolution, the Constitution, and the 4th of July itself. Sometimes July 4th parties would actually fly the Stars and Stripes alongside flags from places like Colombia and Peru. July 4th orators would stand before huge crowds and sing the praises of Latin America and Latin American potential to waves of thunderous applause. So what is going on? I mean, when I first realized the scope of this popular interest in Latin America, I was genuinely stunned. I was actually living in Philadelphia at the time. I kind of put all the pieces together. And I remember walking down Locust Street in this state of just baffled excitement, because I think that we Americans today tend to assume that we're more global, more engaged with the rest of the world than at previous points in our history. And in some ways, in terms of the speed and instantaneity of our connections, sure, that's probably true, but there are other ways in which I think we've really forgotten just how globally minded, and as I'll talk about today, just how hemispherically minded early Americans actually were. So in order to explain why Latin America had such a place of prominence at July 4th celebrations 200 years ago, I'd like to start just by reflecting that what we in the United States tend to call the American Revolution was also, in a broader sense, the first strike in what I like to call a hemispheric age of American revolutions, so emphasis on the plural there, because in the half century that unfolded between the shot heard around the world in 1775 and the independence of Bolivia in 1825, most of the Western Hemisphere broke away from Europe. So the US, obviously, followed by the independence of Haiti in 1804. And then in the 1810s and 20s, Brazil, as well as the entire Spanish-American mainland, broke away from Spain and Portugal. So everything from Mexico and Colombia to Chile and Peru, all becoming independent, which means that this half century from 1775 to 1825 really was a broader age of American revolutions. It's a pretty staggering geopolitical transformation that takes place in a relatively small swath of time in the scheme of things. And my research really focuses on the second half of that 50-year window and on how the independence wars in Latin America actually shaped the United States. So I'm going to do three main things in my time today. First, I'm going to say more about the why people in the early US were so excited about Latin American independence. Second, I'm going to talk about what this popular enthusiasm tells us about early US understandings of race and revolution and republicanism. And then finally, I'll talk about why this popular enthusiasm for Latin American independence started to decline right around the nation's 50th birthday in 1826, helping to bring this age of American revolutions to a close. And so I'll dive now right into that first point about the why people in the early US were so excited about Latin American independence. And in order to answer that question, let me first just show a few other manifestations of this excitement. We could turn to maps, like this one here. This one is from a popular children's geography textbook. And as you can see, it's actually portraying the entire Western Hemisphere as one united continent, not two continents of North and South America as we tend to do today. And this would have been something that schoolboys and schoolgirls throughout the country would have been taught. We could also turn to songs, like this one. As you can see, this is Bolivar. This is written in honor, of course, of Simón Bolivar, who was known as the so-called liberator of much of northern South America. He's also then and now often referred to as the George Washington of South America. You can see this is Bolivar, as it would have been pronounced here, a Peruvian battle song as sung by Mr. Howard with unbounded applause at Chatham Theater. That's in New York City. But you can see this is actually published in Philadelphia, just a few blocks from Independence Hall. And there were about 20 songs like this, all written in honor of South American independence. If you want more evidence of this excitement about Latin America, could turn from Bolivar songs to Bolivar hats. And this is a bunch of newspaper advertisements for Bolivar hats that I pulled from around the country. Now, I have searched far and wide for an actual image of a Bolivar hat, and I have come up short, but I can tell from verbal descriptions that these probably would have been straw hats with broad brims, lots of feathers, and they were popular among women and girls in the early United States, so this is inspiring women's fashion choices. Now, you might very reasonably be saying, okay, this is all very interesting, but how do we know that this evidence isn't just cherry-picked, right? How do we know your average American actually cares about Latin American independence? Well, two kinds of evidence are quantifiable, and so they give us a sense of just how widespread this interest was. So first was July 4th celebrations. So we'll come back to this picture for a second, and I can give you some actual numbers on this. And I should explain here that the reason we know what happened at July 4th parties is that the people who organized these celebrations would write up transcripts of everything that was said and done, and then they would send those transcripts to their local newspaper editors who would then publish it. And I should also specify, it's not everything that's said and done in these reports, because we know from other sources, letters, diaries, that what actually happened at July 4th celebrations was that the ceremonial gunshots and cannon fire, which you get a sense of kind of represented in these kids playing with toy firearms, it did not mix well. The fireworks too, it did not mix well with the excessive amounts of alcohol that were consumed at these celebrations. So there were accidents, injuries. The drinking rate at this moment was actually approaching an all-time high for American history. So we should really think of these July 4th celebrations as idealized versions of what white Americans thought should have happened on Independence Day. And I've been specifying white Americans because Black Americans were not usually allowed to participate at these early July 4th celebrations because their mere presence increasingly struck white people as inherently threatening on a day meant to celebrate freedom. And I'll get back to African Americans' views and abolitionist views of Latin America in a little bit. But for now, this is just to say that July 4th toasts tell us about white men's views in particular. So what I did was I looked at almost 900 July 4th parties from throughout the country, and I calculated the percentage of parties every year that included toasts to Latin American independence. And here, after all of my number crunching, is what I finally came up with. I mean, the key takeaway really is that in the decade that follows the War of 1812, well over half of July 4th parties included toasts to Latin America. And the way I calculated that number is very conservative. Anecdotally, newspaper editors of all political stripes said that toasts to Latin America were all but universal. And so this is really one of the main points that I make in the book. It's that on the country's most self-consciously patriotic holiday, right, on the one day of the year that people are gathering in self-conscious exploration of the ties that bind them together as a country and a people, Americans are looking abroad to these foreign revolutions. They're looking abroad to define who they are at home. Latin American independence was not only a national craze, in other words, it was also a nationalistic craze. And the reason was that people in the United States thought that Latin American revolutionaries were really just imitating the United States. They were very happy to give themselves credit for everything good that seemed to be happening south of the border. So U.S. observers saw Latin American independence as proof that their own ideals really were universal, as they had always maintained since 1776, and that made them proud. It made them feel important in a global and almost cosmic sense. So in celebrating Latin American independence, people in the U.S. were really also celebrating themselves. And it's really all quite ironic because, just to be very clear on this point, Latin Americans were not, for the most part, imitating the United States. Their independence wars stemmed more immediately from different causes, specifically from the chaos of Europe's Napoleonic Wars. Other historians have shown that insofar as Latin American elites looked abroad for inspiration, they were turning more commonly, in most cases, to Great Britain for inspiration and for aid. And we also know that Latin Americans of African descent looked more commonly to Haiti. But of course, in the U.S., modesty has never really been a national virtue, and so people here were very confident that they were the ones who deserved credit for inspiring Latin Americans to revolt. And in their defense, Latin Americans totally played into this. If you've read the excerpts that was posted on the museum's website, you'll already know that there were dozens of rebel agents in the U.S. in exactly this period often in Philadelphia, within blocks of where the museum stands today. And they were hoping to get aid and diplomatic recognition. So they went around the country telling U.S. audiences exactly what they wanted to hear. They would essentially say, oh, we love the U.S., we want to be just like the United States. Can you please just give us a little bit of money so that we can be sure to succeed in our efforts? And U.S. audiences, although they rarely actually gave the money up front, they ate up the idea that they were responsible for these independence movements. They really liked to believe that. That is how we end up with a newspaper advertisement like this one for Bolivar hats. Now, first of all, this is not probably what a Bolivar hat would have looked like. This is probably just the stock image of a hat that this newspaper printer had. But I wanted to show you that this ad is very strategically placed by a New York City hat salesman on June 29th, 1825. So just a few days before New Yorkers are going to gather in celebration of Independence Day. And the salesman actually goes on to say at the end here that readers should buy his Bolivar hats specifically so that they can wear them to July 4th parties to showcase their patriotism, which is kind of counterintuitive that you could showcase your U.S. patriotism by wearing a hat that honors a Spanish-speaking South American statesman. But that's because to show support for Latin America is to show support for the United States. In any case, all of this is to say that July 4th toasts are the first quantifiable evidence that I turned to. The second quantifiable evidence that I looked at to study popular U.S. thinking about Latin America was this here. So this is a page from the 1850 U.S. Census, and as you can see at the top, it says free inhabitants in blank in the county of Lawrence, state of Illinois. Lawrence County, Illinois, it's in the eastern part of the state. And this is a community of farmers. It's so rural that there's not a town name listed here. It just goes by the county. On the 30th day of September, 1850, William Y. Christie, assistant marshal. And essentially, this census taker, William Christie, went from farm to farm, knocking on doors and saying, who lives here? What are their names? What are their ages? It's essentially the in-person version of the electronic 2020 census that we all hopefully filled out over the past several months. This is how it was done 200 years ago, much more labor-intensive in this data collection. Okay, now the next slide is going to zoom in on this last household here so that we can read it. Okay. So we can see here, James Knabb is listed as head of household, 59 years old, male. Nothing is listed in the color column, which by 19th century standards means he's white. Farmer, he's got some real estate, born in Maryland. Then right underneath him is his wife, Barbara. And then underneath them is their son, named, of course, Bolivar. And because this is the 1850 census, and he's 25 years old. That means he was born around 1825, right here in Illinois. He's a farmer like his father. And I think it's interesting, too, that his younger brother is named Hamilton, which I don't know, maybe gives you a sense of the parents' priorities here. But the bigger point for now is just that little Bolivar Knabb was just one of many. By 1830, I found about 200 baby Bolivars crying, slobbering their way through the United States. I always like to call this the Bolivar baby boom. And one thing that I like about this Bolivar baby boom is that it's coming from mothers as well as fathers. So we get a sense here of women's engagement in Latin American independence. We also get a sense of geographic range because, as you see here, these parents are not just East Coast urbanites. They're also, in this case, Midwestern farmers. They're Southern slaveholders. In some cases, we see free Black men who seem to take on the name Bolivar as a last name when they win their independence or their freedom. I've found a free Black mother who names her son Simon Bolivar, so first name, last name. And for reasons that I'll get to in a little bit. But for now, the point is just that these baby Bolivars really do represent a cross-section of the country. So not only do their mothers and fathers have access to information on Latin America, which they're probably getting through newspapers and word of mouth, but they're emotionally and personally invested in what's happening there to the extent that they're naming their sons and sometimes themselves after this Spanish-speaking Catholic revolutionary. And I should add, too, that this is more than just rhetoric. This is more than just superficial excitement, because people in the U.S. actually do several concrete things in support of Latin American independence. So I scoured diplomatic archives in the U.S. and in Latin America, as well as thousands of pages in the U.S. congressional record, and I found 3 concrete things that resulted partly from this popular enthusiasm. First is that thousands of U.S. citizens actually took up arms for Latin American independence, usually as privateers, but sometimes also they enlist directly in insurgent navies in Latin America. Second, I found that U.S. merchants and manufacturers were one of the rebels' biggest foreign suppliers of arms and ammunition, second to Great Britain. And then finally, third, the United States became the first country in the world to extend formal diplomatic recognition to mainland Spanish America, which happened in 1822, and to Brazil in 1824. And that's, of course, the context for the 1823 Monroe Doctrine, in which the U.S. famously declares the Western Hemisphere off limits to further European colonization attempts. Now, I don't want to exaggerate the extent of this military or diplomatic support for Latin America, because to be very clear, the United States never does for Latin America what France had done for the United States. This is actually one reason that Spanish America's independence wars took so much longer than the United States' did, and with more destruction. It's that the United States got game-changing foreign aid on very generous terms, whereas Spanish Americans really didn't. So when we think about the different trajectories of the United States and Spanish America after independence, this structural factor is a key part of the reason that Spanish Americans didn't have a really powerful foreign ally leap in like the United States had. Anyway, all of this is to say that the popular enthusiasm for Latin American independence is one factor that helps to bend U.S. policy in a direction that, on balance, helps Latin American revolutionaries, albeit in a pretty cautious and limited way. All of that said, though, my book is really less about this kind of high-level diplomacy, and it's more about what the popular excitement about Latin America tells us about the early United States. So let's turn now directly to this question. What does this hemispheric excitement tell us about the early U.S.? It's the question that drives my book, and there are 3 big points that I want to make here. First is a point that I already made about how the inter-American excitement was a key driver of U.S. nationalism after the War of 1812. Because Americans, again, are just so excited to think that they have inspired Latin Americans to revolution, and it makes them feel very important. But I'll acknowledge that at some level, if you zoom out to the big picture here, what I've told you so far may not seem all that surprising. I mean, here we have a set of foreign revolutions waged by people who call themselves Americans and who at least occasionally invoke the U.S. example. So of course people in the United States are excited about it. I think there's a sort of intuitive logic to what I've been telling you so far. If anything is surprising about all of this, it's probably just the sheer scope of the interest in Latin America at a grassroots and sometimes even quantitative level. So at this point, I want to throw in a wrinkle and explain why I think this story is also qualitatively interesting. And this is the second key point that I make in the book, and so the second key point that I want to emphasize today, it's that this hemispheric excitement thrived amidst obvious religious and especially racial differences. So for one thing, U.S. observers rarely dwelled on Latin Americans' Catholicism. It was as if republicanism spread abroad was so exhilarating that it overshadowed concerns about religion. Still more importantly to my research, Spanish Americans in particular were implementing gradual anti-slavery measures during their independence wars as part of their military strategy. They were also, in some places, elevating elite men of color to positions of military and political authority. So to put all of that another way, Spanish Americans at least purported to be building multiracial republics in word and in rhetoric, if not always in deed. And these developments are widely understood in the U.S. Newspapers almost universally reported on Spanish American anti-slavery efforts and related measures. And yet the popular jubilation about Latin America continued for years, just as it had before, even in the Deep South. This is probably the most surprising thing I found in all of my research. I mean, I had expected white U.S. observers to recoil at news of Spanish American anti-slavery, much as they had done with the slave revolt in nearby Haiti in the 1790s that led to Haitian independence. But instead, U.S. reactions to Spanish American anti-slavery ranged more between nonchalance and outright support. And for the sake of time, I'm just going to give one example of what this looked like. And that is that in 1816, Simón Bolivar, on the left here, famously sailed to the Republic of Haiti in search of aid. And while he's there, he meets with Haiti's president, Alexandre Pétion, and Pétion obliges. He gives Bolivar various forms of material aid on the condition that Bolivar then promise to end slavery in all of the lands that he claws away from Spain. And Bolivar agrees to this condition more or less. I mean, at least in the moment, he agrees to this condition. So at this point, I proceeded by sampling 128 U.S. newspapers from mid-1816, when news of Bolivar's Haitian alliance is washing up on U.S. shores. The first thing I found was that over 90% of U.S. newspapers reported on this development, which was, mind you, an international, interracial, anti-slavery alliance that is mobilizing just south of the U.S. border. Even more surprisingly, U.S. editors were not reporting on this alliance out of fear or hatred, because most of the reports were actually positive. Even slaveholding editors in the Deep South seemed unfazed by Bolivar's Haitian alliance, and some even praised Bolivar as a Republican hero. So in Milledgeville, Georgia, for example, the local editor, who was himself a slaveholder in a majority Black enslaved town, wrote in this newspaper here, this is the Georgia Journal, he wrote that the progress of the revolution in South America resembled so much our own nation's struggle for freedom, even though in the very next paragraph, this Georgia editor matter-of-factly reminded readers that, as he put it, General Bolivar had retired with many of his followers to the island of St. Domingo, Haiti, where he organized a new expedition. So this editor is simply more excited about Bolivar's promises to free South America than he was anxious about Bolivar's promises to free the slaves. He's essentially shrugging his shoulders and saying, okay, whatever Bolivar has to do to win independence from Spain is okay with me. And as far as I can tell, readers seem satisfied with this support, with this report, and with other similar ones as well, because they continue to toast Spanish America a couple days later at their July 4th celebrations. And the editor actually went on to serve as mayor as well as a U.S. representative. So what is going on? How can this slaveholding Georgia editor have this nonchalant and even supportive reaction to Bolivar's Haitian alliance, right? Instead of panicking, he is equating Bolivar with the tradition of 1776. And I should say there are scores of similar examples here. Well, I will just give two of the biggest reasons that underlay this, that white Americans' kind of nonchalance about Spanish American anti-slavery and their sometimes support of it. One reason is that emancipation in most of Spanish America was painstakingly, painfully gradual. It resembled the same model that a lot of northern states in the United States, including Pennsylvania, had implemented in the wake of their own revolution, and in fact, the same model that thousands of white Southerners were still talking about and considering. So Spanish American emancipation, in that sense, differed from Haitian emancipation, which of course came on the heels of a slave uprising. And to white U.S. audiences, Spanish America's more gradual model was kind of reassuringly familiar. It's a model that white people in the U.S. knew often firsthand and really understood. A second reason that Spanish American emancipation didn't raise many eyebrows in the United States was that Spanish America was generally far enough away that it existed as an abstraction more than as a reality in the eyes of U.S. observers. It was generally far enough away that it didn't seem to pose the same kind of immediate threat that the slave revolt in nearby Haiti had seemed to do before. And we could talk about how Mexico fits in here, but for the most part, you can think of Spanish America as a kind of laboratory in which these insurgents could work out different solutions to this problem of having slavery in a republic without, people in the U.S. could really observe that laboratory without really feeling immediately threatened by whatever happens there. So newspaper editors were undaunted by reports that Spanish Americans were building these ostensibly multiracial republics, and readers seem to have been undaunted as well, because as I said, even in the South, the baby Bolivar boom continues, the July 4th toasts continue, and so forth. So U.S. observers' gut moral instinct seems to have been that it was perfectly reasonable, perhaps even admirable, for American republics to end slavery. Maybe not in this republic or in this lifetime, but someday, somewhere. As the Kentucky enslaver Henry Clay put on the floor of Congress in 1820, and this is, mind you, in the heat of the Missouri crisis, when the nation was potentially, it seems like it was possibly going to divide along sectional lines, Clay stands on the floor of Congress and says that in some particulars, the people of South America were in advance of us. Grenada, in other words, Colombia, Venezuela, and Buenos Aires had all emancipated their slaves. Now, incidentally, as a side note to all of this, if I had a photo with higher resolution, we could zoom in on this document that Clay is holding. It is a copy of an 1821 House resolution that Clay successfully sponsored. It essentially said that the House of Representatives supported Latin American independence alongside the people of the United States. So it's really interesting because in choosing to pose for this portrait with this statement of hemispheric and Republican solidarity, Clay is really showing how central support for Latin American independence really was to his own political identity. But back to this issue of race and revolution, what's so interesting to me about it is that at home, of course, the United States was undeniably and increasingly even a white man's republic. But when those same white men looked abroad to Spanish America, the ostensibly egalitarian and universalist narrative of 1776 prevailed. And what I mean by that is just the narrative about inalienable rights and self-evident truths and all men being created equal. That's the strain of revolutionary thought, of which there were many, that ultimately underlay the popular enthusiasm for Spanish America and its ostensibly multiracial republics. They're essentially saying, okay, yes, this too is what we stand for. We can get behind these anti-slavery Catholic republics in spirit, even if ending slavery nationwide is not exactly what we want to push for in the here and now. Now, obviously, there were big exceptions to this tendency to focus on shared Republican principles over racial difference. But for now, I want to briefly foreshadow what comes next by pointing out just one major weakness of this universalist optimism. And that is that, yes, U.S. editors' collective emphasis on shared Republican principles over racial difference constituted a kind of universalism and egalitarianism, but it simultaneously rendered that egalitarianism shallow. The reason that Spanish-American race relations didn't especially concern newspaper editors was that editors didn't think very carefully about racial equality to begin with. They were more excited about the spread of Republican government and anti-colonial revolution than they were concerned with deeper questions of social equality. So they could accept Spanish-American anti-slavery, but they didn't necessarily think too hard about what it would mean to implement similar measures at home in the here and now. Interestingly, the one group who really took Spanish America's anti-slavery tendency seriously were anti-slavery activists who held up Spanish America as a model for the United States. So unlike, most white Americans see the U.S. as the model for Spanish America, anti-slavery activists reverse that equation. And anti-slavery, just to make this connection, is probably what free Black people had in mind when they named themselves and their sons after Simón Bolivar, his anti-slavery tendencies. And here is the cover page, the masthead from the first issue of Freedom's Journal. So Freedom's Journal is the first Black edited and owned and operated newspaper in all of U.S. history. And you can see this column here, to our patrons. This is where they're explaining explicitly why they think it's important to have this newspaper, what they want to contribute, what their vision is. And sure enough, in this very first column of this very first issue of the first Black edited newspaper in American history, the editors actually talk about Spanish America as evidence that multiracial republics are possible. So as you can see here, they write, "Has the eternal decree gone forth that our race alone are to remain in this state while knowledge and civilization are shedding their enlivening rays over the rest of the human family? The establishment of the Republic of Haiti," now you can kind of read along up here, "after years of sanguinary warfare, its subsequent progress in all the arts of civilization, and the advancement of liberal ideas in South America, where despotism has given place to free governments and where many of our brethren now fill important civil and military stations, prove the contrary." So Spanish America is fundamental to their vision of what's possible for American nations to achieve. Now, I've looked at all the issues of this newspaper, which ran through 1829, and over half of them continue to reference Latin America in some way or other. Now, I should clarify that abolitionists' take on Spanish America turns out to be overly optimistic. Spanish Americans had not successfully established racial democracies. Racial equality and slavery itself proved stubbornly persistent in Spanish America, much as they would in the United States. But for various reasons, partly because of their lack of totally accurate information, U.S. abolitionists offer a more positive spin. Okay, in any case, just to recapitulate what I've said so far, if the first key point I make in my book is that Latin American independence fueled U.S. nationalism, the second is that this first half century after the revolution in the United States truly was an age of American revolutions, not only because Latin Americans were themselves casting off European rule, but also because so many people in the United States saw those efforts as these kind of glorious tropical reprises of 1776. For some 50 years, people throughout the U.S. remained abstractly committed to the egalitarian principles of their own independence war. And it was precisely those principles that enabled white U.S. onlookers to knowingly and emotionally embrace a group of multiracial foreign revolutionaries whose battles were at once anti-colonial and anti-slavery. So popular enthusiasm for Spanish America reveals the persistence of some of those older revolutionary ideals about inalienable rights and self-evident truths. But Of course, as I already mentioned, this is all happening at a time when human bondage, slavery, is spreading and deepening at home. And so sure enough, that kind of sanguine, egalitarian rhetoric was under growing siege by the mid to late 1820s. And this brings me to the third and final point I make in the book, and the third and final point that I want to very briefly make before stopping for questions. And that is that in this period on the graph, where the popular enthusiasm for Latin America really begins to decline, quite precipitously, as you can see. There's a lot of reasons for this change, most of which have to do with the wave of political instability throughout Latin America, and that leaves a lot of U.S. onlookers feeling disillusioned and disappointed. But as a U.S. historian, I'm more interested in another reason for the declining excitement, and that is that this drop-off in hemispheric enthusiasm represents the beginnings of a shift away from that earlier period of universalist and egalitarian revolutionary ideals, and a shift instead towards a newer era of avowedly white U.S. exceptionalism. What happened is that in 1826, the Democratic Party took its first united partisan stand on all things on an issue of hemispheric policy. So, in other words, the Democratic Party first started to coalesce by intentionally picking a fight over Latin America. The issue in a nutshell was that the U.S. had just been invited to send delegates to the first ever Inter-American Congress, which was to be held in Panama in 1826. And rising Democrats argued that the United States should not send representatives to this Panama Congress. They gave lots of reasons for this, but one of the key reasons that Southern Democrats in particular gave was that, in their view, Spanish America's new republics were too anti-slavery, too radical, and too black. So essentially, for the first time in thousands of pages of congressional debates that I've looked at from about 1810 through 1826, rising Southern Democrats started using Spanish America as a blackened and radicalized foil against which to portray the United States and its own revolution as uniquely moderate, uniquely successful, and uniquely white. And again, that kind of rhetoric had been virtually non-existent in Congress and also pretty rare in U.S. newspapers before 1826. So what changes in 1826? Why do Southern Democrats in particular start adopting such racialized invective towards Spanish America? Well, the short answer is the time was ripe for it. And by way of context here, let me also just note that 1826 was, of course, the 50th anniversary of the nation's birthday, as people called it. The revolutionary generation was passing away, a new generation was taking the helm, and it's this moment of great national soul-searching. And think, too, about what the U.S. looked like by 1826. There was a growing gap between, on one hand, the nation's egalitarian rhetoric of inalienable rights and self-evident truths, and on the other hand, the increasingly unequal reality, not least as slavery spread throughout the South. And that growing gap between rhetoric and reality was just not sustainable. Something's got to give. And there's really only two basic ways a gap like that can close. You can change the reality to live up to the rhetoric, which is what anti-slavery activists were pushing for, try to make the nation live up to those high egalitarian ideals. Or you could just change the rhetoric to match the reality. Right? You could openly champion racial inequality rather than tiptoeing around it. You could give voice to the prejudice that was obviously already there. And that's what these kind of emerging Southern Democrats start to do. So to give just one example really quick before wrapping up, we can look at Virginia Senator John Randolph, who stood on the floor of Congress in these debates over Latin America and insisted that, as he put it, these principles that all men are born free and equal, I can never assent to, for the best of all reasons, Randolph says, because it is not true. Randolph went on to call the Declaration of Independence a most pernicious falsehood and a fanfaronade of abstractions. So as we approach another 4th of July, I think it's really important to reflect on how these ideas of equality and rights have always been contested in American history, including by politicians like Randolph, who played to popular prejudice in newly unabashed ways and with explosive effects. I mean, sure enough, Randolph's rhetoric really caught on, especially in Southern and Democratic newspapers, and that's one reason for that decline in hemispheric July 4th toasts and baby Bolivar naming. And that rhetoric persisted with especially dramatic consequences down the road in things like the war with Mexico, when the United States provoked a war with what it had so recently called a sister republic. And of course, you also see the explosive effects of this kind of rhetoric in the Civil War itself. So in conclusion, if U.S. observers in the 1810s and early 1820s had derived a sense of patriotic identity from republicanism spread into new and largely non-white places, by the nation's 50th birthday, some members of a new generation were using Spanish America to define a narrower kind of nationalism, one that proclaimed the nation's uniqueness rather than its universality. And I think I will stop there for questions. So thank you very much. I'm eager for your questions, and let me take myself out of screen share. Great.
Yep, I think I'm back.
Yes.
I'm back? Fantastic. Well, you know, incredible. I'll never be the same after hearing about baby Bolivars. So, absolutely. So, we're going to run a little over, and we'll just keep talking as long as you've got energy. But for anyone who has to drop off, we are recording tonight's session, and so it will be available on our website, and you know we'll make sure everybody has access if you have to drop off, or if you just like to listen to this fascinating presentation again. So I guess a first question that's come in from the Goslins, Kevin and Andrea Goslin, I think speaks to the question of the kind of historical memory of this era. They point out that in 1965, the United States Navy named a ballistic missile submarine after Simon Bolivar. And I guess the question what's going on? Is this a reflection of the civil rights movement? Is it connected to awareness of another era of Latin American revolutions? This one may be one that the United States had a different relationship and attitude toward, and to give any insights into that.
Yeah, I mean, I would really have to look more at the specific context, and I think you said the 1960s, to know exactly what piece of that tradition people had in mind when they gave that name. But I think when most people remember Simon Bolivar today, it's usually just the fact that he's the George Washington of South America. Of course, Washington himself, in his will, liberated his slaves, not his wife's, but so I mean, there is that anti-slavery tradition that, I mean, it's very contested and very ambivalent, as Erica Armstrong Dunbar and others have shown. But I mean, you could draw that tradition out of Washington's life in an ambivalent way, in the same kind of way that you could draw out of Bolivar's life as well. So it's possible to highlight that anti-slavery piece for both someone like Washington and for Bolivar in similarly ambivalent and limited ways. But again, I'm not sure what what people had in mind with that naming in the 1960s.
Sure, interesting. Rafael Maldonado asks, very interesting, did Bolivar, and I guess by extension, or any of these other revolutionaries ever visit the U.S.? Yeah,
so Bolivar did at a younger age. He was, impressed by certain elements of the United States' political tradition. Like a lot of Spanish Americans, both those who came to the United States and those who read about it, they were impressed by the United States' economic growth and its political stability, such as it was. But they also were pretty skeptical that that model could apply to Spanish America. So Bolivar once says that although the Constitution of the United States is the best governing document in the world, that the Quran would be a better fit for Spanish America's republics, just because the societies were kind of like apples and oranges to Bolivar and to a lot of other Spanish Americans as well. So yes, Bolivar and other Spanish Americans are in the United States. They find some things to admire, but also see it as something that's hard to just take and copy for Spanish America in particular.
Interesting. You touched on the kind of Catholicism of the populations here, and I'm curious, this is, of course, an era of very strong anti-Catholic sentiment, and of course, there's a kind of political and cultural tradition of the Black legend about Spanish America. And, you may have answered that just merely by observing that South America was a bit of an abstraction, but is there anything more you'd want to embellish that subject about anti-Catholicism?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is another of the things that really surprised me about this research, is that in much the same way that white people in the U.S. were kind of willing to, they were putting shared Republican principles over racial difference, they're also putting shared Republican principles over religious difference. So it's surprising because, of course, as you say, there's a centuries-old tradition of anti-Catholicism in the English-speaking Protestant world. But it's almost as though in the very act of declaring independence and kind of instigating these revolutions, in the eyes of U.S. Protestants, it's as though Spanish American Catholics had redeemed Catholicism in the very act of revolution. So U.S. Protestants were actually thrilled to see what was happening, what these Spanish American Catholics were doing. They're thrilled to give them the benefit of the doubt. And they really don't seem too bothered by questions of religion at all. They don't talk about religion even, or as Catholicism, as much of a problem to explain after 1815. In fact, when Catholicism is discussed, most U.S. Protestants describe it as a positive thing. They say, wow, it's a good thing that Latin American priests are leading their people in revolution. And they say those priests are a lot like the ministers who tended to our troops in our own revolution at Valley Forge, and they compare these priests to Jesus. So I would actually say that, I mean, in the time since my book came out, there's been a body of kind of new work on U.S. religious history that actually is kind of revising what we think we know about anti-Catholicism, where these historians have suggested that really vituperative anti-Catholicism that you see by the 1840s and 50s with the Irish potato famine and so forth, that's not actually typical of what you saw earlier in the 19th century. And in fact, it's a reaction against that an earlier period of relative acceptance of U.S. Catholics. And I think my work kind of fits right alongside that new work. In fact, the one voice I've found who is regularly invoking that anti-Catholicism was a white anti-slavery editor, a Quaker named Benjamin Lundy, who he published a newspaper in the 1820s, and he constantly said, how can we let these Catholics outstrip us Protestants, these liberty-loving Protestants, in the work of anti-slavery? So he's the main anti-Catholic voice, and he's actually coming from a place of really respecting what these Spanish American Catholics have been able to do.
Fascinating, yeah. A related question from Paul Soltis, who's one of our viewers tonight. He's asking about Our Lady of Guadalupe, and asking, was this an important icon during the period as a symbol of unification? Did you encounter any evidence?
On the U.S. side, I have not seen much of that in the U.S. side, and I think that may partly be because Mexico in particular was not it was surprisingly peripheral in this hemispheric excitement for reasons that I think are incidental to Mexico and more a coincidence of timing, that Mexico's popular Republican rebellion really peaked from 1810 to 1815, which is, of course, when the United States is consumed by its own transatlantic conflicts with Great Britain. By the time the U.S. finally starts to look south after 1815, Mexico's popular rebellion had been brutally crushed Mexico doesn't declare independence until 1821, and then it does so as a monarchy. So I think part of that, the reason might be that Mexico, and part of the reason that I haven't seen much of the Virgin Guadalupe is that Mexico is just not a very central part of this hemispheric enthusiasm.
Interesting, yeah. Yeah, we forget we're talking about vast expanses of very diverse populations and great spans of geography. Roger Townsend actually brings up an interesting question about Native Americans or the native populations of these two hemispheres, and did the indigenous populations in South America kind of figure into the discussions? Was this considered to be were there any connections with what's going on? Of course, Andrew Jackson in the news a lot lately about what's going on with Native Americans in the early republic at this period.
Yeah, I looked for that, and I mean, it was really striking to me how so much of the public narrative in the United States about Latin America operated on more of a black-white spectrum. There's a lot of reasons for that. I think a lot of the news in the U.S. is on Colombia and Venezuela, and especially the port cities of Colombia and Venezuela, in which there was a higher population of African descent and a relatively lower population of indigenous descent than you might have seen in a place like Peru or Mexico. So I already explained just now why Mexico doesn't get more attention, and I think that's one reason there's less focus on indigenous people in the hemispheric enthusiasm. The same thing actually goes for the hemisphere's other kind of center of indigenous population, which is in Peru. Peru was, it declared independence relatively late for mainland Spanish America, and when it does secure independence, it does so because, at the hands of an outsider, Simón Bolivar, who goes to Peru. And so that again kind of takes the focus of U.S. news reports and discussions away from the indigenous population and back towards this sort of the black-white narrative that I kind of highlighted in the talk today. So I think, actually it would be really interesting to look at, above all, if indigenous people ever have that kind of a hemispheric perspective. I think we can see glimpses of it in places, but I think that's something that we really might know more about. But you don't see a lot of it in this kind of hemispheric enthusiasm in the U.S.
Interesting. Yeah, great stuff. Well, I wonder, just as kind of maybe as a wrap-up question, like to try to bridge past and the present and perhaps the future. Of course, we're as a hemisphere in terms of the where people of these various descents are living. America is much more connected. Our neighbors now, fellow Americans, fellow citizens, have a personal connection to these revolutions. And the history, as it has often been taught, or the popular memory of connections north and south in this hemisphere, have really focused on stories of conquest, hemispheric domination, expansion, and you have a interesting perspective on your story of at least a moment in which unity was the story. And I'm just curious, as you look at today and how we're growing as a people, what lessons does your story offer for thinking about the more perfect union that we're all in quest of right now?
Yeah.
And more broadly, a more perfect world.
Yeah, absolutely. I will try to do justice to that. So I'm smiling because when people hear that I work on early U.S. relations with Latin America, one of the responses I often get is, wow, that must be a very grim story. And it's true. The story of expansion and filibustering and warfare, it is grim. It's a defining story of American history, literally defining in the sense that it defines our nation's borders even to the present day, which is, of course, a topic of great dispute and public import today. But it's also, one thing I try to do in my work is show that that's not the only story. And one reason I think that narrative of conflict has dominated is that historians have really emphasized U.S. relations with nearby places, Mexico, Florida, Cuba. But as I said, in my research, I found that most of these hemispheric enthusiasts are actually paying way more attention to South America. It's 80% of hemispheric toasts are to South America. Only 4% are to Mexico. You see the same pattern with songs, baby names. They're almost always to South Americans. And when you have that geographic focus on South America, more distant places, it kind of paves the way to a narrative that's much more about unity and sister republics. So I actually think these two narratives, one of conflict, one of cooperation and unity, they're not actually mutually opposed, because there's a way in which the same kind of nationalist arrogance that enabled people in the United States to assume that they were responsible for everything good that happened south of the border, when of course they weren't, and the same kind of nationalist arrogance that then enabled them to conclude that what had worked for them would work for everybody else. That same arrogance is what underlies that narrative of conflict. It's that arrogance that enables Manifest Destiny and war with Mexico and filibustering. So I think that what I'm trying to do in my work is show that these two stories of conflict and cooperation they explain each other. And so we really have to pull out both of those strands. And so I think at a moment where we have, in our current time, where we have, I would say, more of a narrative of conflict in U.S. relations with Latin America, especially through immigration, it's worth remembering that there also is this history of commonality and collaboration as well. Always contested. I don't want to put too sunny a face on it, but it is, our history is rich and it contains many parts, and this is one piece of it.
Fabulous. Thank you. Well, Dr. Caitlin Fitz, this has been absolutely great conclusion to our 2019-2020 speaker series. Again, I'm sorry that we weren't gathered all in person in Liberty Hall together. We're so grateful to have for Trust, our sponsor of this series. I know that you'll be back when the doors are open again soon. I'm just curious, just as a last little question, what are you working on now? What's the big tome going to be?
Yeah, so I am following up on some of the questions that I actually addressed in the presentation. I'm looking at how Latin America and Latin Americans actually shaped U.S. abolitionism and equal rights activism, and how they helped to kind of radicalize the United States in a pivotal moment in the 1830s. So I'm following through some of those strings that I mentioned with Freedom's Journal and early abolitionists, including Latin Americans of color who came to the United States and brought these kind of revolutionary anti-slavery ideas to epicenters of anti-slavery activity in the U.S., places like Boston, Philadelphia, and so forth. So stay tuned.
Well, I know you'll be back to report on your work.
Yes.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much. Thanks to everyone who's tuned in, well over, I think, 100 people at our peak this evening. And again, this will all be available to watch again and hopefully to share. Thanks to those of you who are members of the museum. Even though we're closed right now, your support has been so critical in allowing us to pivot quickly and to offer such rich and robust virtual experiences like the speakers series this evening. So thanks all, and we'll see you all soon.
Yes, happy July 4th and stay safe.
You as well.